Chapter 1. The Denver Archive. On February 4th, 2026, I requested a box from the National Archives facility in Denver. The request appeared harmless enough to survive any clerk's attention. The subject line was water table depletion in the Colorado River Basin between 1970 and 1980, and the category chain moved through agriculture, mineral extraction, and regional groundwater strain. Nothing in the retrieval slip suggested weapons testing. Nothing in the shelf code suggested containment. That is how the file survived. Bureaucracy hides its most dangerous material by making it look dull, because the human brain discards boredom faster than it discards threat. If a document looks dry enough, the viewer stops hunting for meaning and begins saving energy. The box arrived at 10:17 in the morning. Gray cardboard. Splitting corners. One softened archive label. Subsurface mineral assessments. Rio Blanco County, 1976, Dr. B. Inside were irrigation tables, lease correspondence, pumping estimates, mineral invoices, and state water transfer memoranda written in the flat language of offices designed to outlive the people inside them. The material had one shared function. It trained attention to relax. Then the bottom folder shifted. Beneath it, pressed against the cardboard, was a 41-page technical appendix bound with 2 rusted brass fasteners. Its title had been struck through with black grease pencil, but the author line remained readable. Senior Seismologist Dr. Vance talked to. I checked the public state geological registries first, expecting at least a trace of him in the Rio Blanco monitoring literature. His name was missing. His station codes were missing. His borehole calibration references had been removed from later stability models. That was the first abnormality. Forgotten scientists leave residue. A procurement signature. A calibration note. A conference abstract. A co-authored technical reference. Vance left a clean negative space, and clean negative spaces are rarely produced by neglect. They are produced by offices with enough time to revise indexes, enough authority to redirect citations, and enough fear to isolate one man's instruments from an entire regional model. The first page carried a pencil note in the left margin. Do not integrate Vance data into Western stability model. Below it, in a second hand, someone had written another sentence. Compromises structural continuity assumptions. That phrase contains no emotion. It does not warn. It does not plead. It simply states that Vance's measurements threaten the model used to describe the American West as mechanically continuous. A model is a civic sedative. It lets roads be financed, pipelines approved, insurers calmed, mineral leases sold, and citizens reassured that the ground beneath them is passive. The model does not need to be perfect. It needs to be stable enough for money to move across it. Vance's data introduced a responding ground. Detonated radioactive in a category no dosimeter could measure. The official history of the Rio Blanco site begins with Project Plowshare, the real federal program that tested nuclear explosives for civilian engineering. The sales vocabulary was optimistic. Gas stimulation, deep fracture, industrial extraction, peaceful nuclear excavation. The engineering reality was less clean. On May 17, 1973, 3 nuclear devices were detonated in a single borehole in Rio Blanco County, Colorado. Each device carried a yield of 33 kilotons, stacked inside the shale column between roughly 5,840 and 6,690 feet below the surface. The public explanation remained simple. Contaminated gas. Poor economics. Commercial failure. That explanation gives the viewer a closed drawer, and closed drawers are useful in historical memory. A failed nuclear gas experiment sounds irresponsible, expensive and finished, which is exactly the kind of story a public institution prefers. Vance did not call it finished. He called it environmental containment. He used that phrase 9 times. He did not call it stimulation, extraction, or commercial failure. He called it containment, and the repetition was too deliberate to be an accident of style. Scientists repeat terms when they are trying to force a category into existence. The first diagram showed a vertical borehole passing through layered shale with 3 device placements marked along the lower interval. Around the detonation column, Vance had drawn nested compression rings. The rings moved inward. That was the first cognitive break. An underground nuclear detonation should force the surrounding formation outward. Immediate rock should vaporize, cavity walls should melt, shock should propagate, and fracture lines should spread through weakness, density, and pressure gradients. The official diagram showed outward failure. Vance's diagram showed inward acceptance. Someone tried to erase the word acceptance from the caption, but the pressure values survived in the table below it. The numbers did not describe a failed extraction attempt. They described a formation that received an explosion and returned the wrong physical answer. At 11:29 in the Denver reading room, I found the second pencil mark. Do not release. Public interpretation collapses if geology is treated as responsive. The wording is clumsy because the writer was trying to compress a forbidden conclusion into office language. The danger was not merely contamination. The danger was response. If shale could react selectively to force, then the West was not a passive platform. It was an unexamined participant. The archive had trained me to expect a water file. Instead, it delivered the first page of a buried interface. Chapter 2. The Thermodynamic Deficit. At 10 in the morning, Mountain Time, on May 17, 1973, the detonation sequence entered final confirmation. By the time the surface crews withdrew and the instrumentation channels went live, the expected pressure spike had already been modeled at 4,000 pounds per square inch. Thermal expansion was expected. Fracture propagation was calculated. Vitrified cavity lining was predicted. The rock should have obeyed the sequence. It answered with vacuum. 40 seconds after ignition, the downhole pressure gauges did not climb toward the projected pressure interval. Across 4 redundant instrument channels, the readings dropped through the instrument floor and stabilized at 0 pounds per square inch. Absolute vacuum. Vance did not accept the easy explanation because easy explanations are where bad science goes to sleep. A single gauge can fail. A detonation can shred a cable. A pressure line can saturate during shock arrival and return nonsense. 4 separated lines returning the same impossible value create a different category. They become a repeated measurement. The vacuum state lasted 11 minutes and 18 seconds. During that period, the cavity should have been expanding into a high-pressure thermal pocket. Yet the shale behaved as if internal pressure had been removed from the system rather than amplified by it. A nuclear device had been fired into rock. The rock subtracted pressure. That is the kind of violation the brain cannot close quickly, because explosions are supposed to add force, heat, damage, and noise. When the event removes the very category it should create, attention remains open, hunting for the mechanism. But Vance had no mechanism. He built tables. The second anomaly appeared in the thermal section, where the expected post-shot material should have included melted shale, radioactive glass, and fractured cavity surfaces. Vance's indirect readings showed an inward-facing thermal shell instead of ordinary outward decay. The hottest values curved toward the detonation column. The outer formation remained too cool. A measurable portion of the blast energy failed to appear as heat, fracture, or seismic propagation. Vance called this missing category a thermodynamic deficit, then circled the phrase twice in red pencil. A later reviewer added one instruction beside it. Do not reproduce. Energy does not vanish from physics. It changes custody. The only question was where the custody had moved. Page 14 contained Vance's material conversion model, and the language became noticeably more careful. Near the detonation interval, the shale had failed to vitrify according to prediction. Later, core comparisons suggested a dense carbon-rich matrix with graphitic behavior, although Vance refused to overstate the laboratory chain. His phrase was precise. Graphitic conversion without normal precursor behavior. The pressure behavior was inverted, the thermal distribution was incomplete, conductivity collapsed, and density increased. The altered interval became less like damaged shale and more like a sealed carbon architecture built under force. Then the acoustic behavior changed. At 49 seconds post-ignition, field seismographs registered a discontinuity that did not match blast decay. Vance compared near-field instruments with 3 regional arrays in Utah and Wyoming, expecting equipment saturation or ordinary attenuation. He found a boundary. Inside a 12-mile radius, natural crustal microtremors ceased. Outside that radius, they continued. That line should not exist in ordinary geology. Faults cross administrative zones, fluids migrate through pressure gradients, and rock settles according to weight, fracture, temperature, and time. Natural ground does not produce a clean behavioral perimeter around a federal borehole. The 12-mile quiet zone behaved like an imposed field. Vance checked wind interference and rejected it. He checked equipment damage and rejected it. He checked power loss, signal saturation, surface vibration masking, and post-blast calibration drift, then rejected each category in sequence. After the final rejection, he typed one sentence. Subsurface medium is behaving as a selective acoustic sink. The clean agency copy erased the phrase, but the original retained the pressure marks from the typewriter keys. A selective acoustic sink is not a normal geological category. It describes a medium that absorbs vibrational energy while refusing to transmit routine background motion back through the crust. The basin did not become quiet. It became acoustically unavailable. For 9 hours and 22 minutes, the microtremor field remained suppressed. Then ordinary vibration returned gradually, beginning at the outer boundary and moving inward, as though the radius itself was recovering from contact. Instrument repair begins at the machine. This recovery began at the edge. At 7:43 in the evening, low-amplitude crustal motion returned along the northern monitoring line. At 8:11 in the evening, western stations resumed ordinary noise. At 8:46 in the evening, near-field sensors began recording incomplete tremor signatures, with the borehole remaining functionally silent. Functionally silent is not the same as dead. It means the ground returned signals only under direct stimulus, while incidental motion remained gated, filtered, or withheld. That difference matters because dead material decays passively. A gated system applies conditions. Vance's final table in this section compared expected behavior with observed behavior. Pressure expansion became pressure collapse. Vitrification became graphitic conversion. Seismic propagation became acoustic suppression. Fracture stimulation became boundary formation. The official report compressed all of this into one phrase: commercial failure. That phrase performs a quiet administrative miracle. It moves a technical impossibility into an economic drawer, closes the drawer, and instructs future readers to discuss contaminated gas instead of responsive geology. Vance refused the drawer. That refusal made his notebook a liability. Chapter 3. The Silent Core Audit. In 1975, A secondary drilling operation was authorized near the Rio Blanco cavity system. The public justification was routine evaluation. The internal justification was cavity assessment. Vance used a third phrase, written in the header of a section the agency copy tried to reorder. Silent Core Audit. The operation began with standard steel drill assemblies, and the secondary shaft was offset from the original borehole under the official logic of contamination control. Vance's map suggested a different purpose. The shaft was not placed to inspect ordinary fracture geometry. It was placed near the acoustic boundary. They were sampling the edge of refusal. This chapter should not be read as 4 biographies. That would flatten the section into personnel fatigue, the exact failure pattern a hostile archive seems designed to produce. The files are not character stories. They are instrument returns. Each worker touched a different channel of the anomaly: hearing, sight, material contact, movement, respiration, and biological rhythm. The administrative cards appear before the names because the institution was no longer asking who these people were. It was asking what category failed through them. Status code Alpha 17. TAR. Classification: auditory displacement. Subject function: mechanical handling. Review outcome: record partially retained. The name beneath that card is Leon Harrow. Harrow was 42 years old, a drilling mechanic from Grand Junction who had worked uranium support contracts, gas wells, and 2 federal drilling assignments before Rio Blanco. His file reads practical, useful, and unromantic, which makes the later changes harder to discard. Agencies prefer unstable witnesses. Harrow was inconveniently ordinary. His exposure began after he handled the second failed bit assembly. The bit had lost tensile strength without recorded heat exposure, then collapsed into brittle carbon powder under ordinary load. Harrow stood 12 feet from the core table and reported pressure inside his teeth. The shift microphone recorded no machinery. The room carried no acoustic event. His maintenance complaint was crossed out before submission, leaving only one sentence visible. Pressure inside teeth follows the sample. 3 days later, Harrow stopped wearing hearing protection during drilling. He told a supervisor the headphones made the silence louder, a phrase that survived only in Vance's duplicate note because the typed medical summary removed it. Harrow's artifact was a pocket notebook recovered from his locker. The early pages contained normal measurements: rotation speed, bit wear, load estimates, mud behavior. Then, the entries shifted into dot and line groupings arranged in circular tracks, with spacing too regular for panic and too specific for ordinary doodling. They were not Morse code. They were not drilling shorthand. They resembled the microgeometric patterns later seen inside the altered core. The card closes with a downgrade. Subject transferred. Follow-up unnecessary. Nah, Chush. That sentence functions as a lid. The second card interrupts before the viewer can settle into a familiar rhythm. Status code Mike 09 Tortoise. Classification: material contradiction. Subject function: sample stabilization part. Review outcome: injury recoded. The name beneath it is Margaret Kyle. Kyle was 36 years old, a materials technician assigned to sealed sample stabilization after previous work in Wyoming mineral assay preparation. Her exposure was visual first, tactile second, and administrative last. She inspected the blackened core under magnification for 92 minutes. Afterward, she filed a request to replace the microscope light, stating that the sample produced reverse glare. That phrase is mechanically defective because light should reveal surface detail while reduced illumination should conceal it. Kyle found the opposite. When the lamp output decreased, the darker bands became more visible, and additional line tracks emerged inside the crystalline layers. One spacing error occurred every 33rd band, matching the yield number of each Rio Blanco device. Vance highlighted the recurrence without calling it proof. He wrote yield echo possible. 6 days later, Kyle was moving a sealed core cylinder when the suspension strap failed. The strap had been rated for more than 4 times the load, yet it separated into dry strands rather than snapping under tension. The cylinder fell 13 inches onto a steel tray. The tray should have dented. Instead, it buckled into a circular depression wider than the cylinder itself, while Kyle's left hand was crushed between the tray and cabinet lip. The medical note recorded fractures with reduced bruising, as though circulation had decreased before impact. The report called it vascular compression of unknown source. That phrase preserves uncertainty while preventing inference. Kyle returned after 17 days, and her next memo contained only measurements. No hypothesis appeared. No complaint appeared. No interpretive language survived. After the 3rd core inventory revision, her name leaves the file. The next card is shorter, almost impatient. Status code Romeo, 32 Tata. Classification: escape attempt with respiratory deficit. Subject function: low-frequency monitoring monitoring. Review outcome: civilian cause assigned. The name beneath it is Edwin Marr. Marr was 51 years old, a field seismograph operator from Casper, Wyoming, and his work history placed him around boredom, drift, and instrumentation long before Rio Blanco. He maintained remote arrays for oil surveys and federal geophysical programs, where most of the job was knowing when nothing was truly nothing. Marr understood noise. He understood false silence. His exposure came through listening. During the 1975 audit, Vance asked him to compare near-field recordings with the suppressed microtremor intervals from 1973. Marr used headphones to isolate low-frequency artifacts between 32 and 40 Hz, then logged repeated absence pulses. A pulse is presence. An absence pulse is a contradiction. Marr attempted to report the structure to a regional supervisor, and the appendix preserves a carbon copy of his unsent letter. Most of the body was redacted, but the closing line remained visible. The ground is refusing the instrument. That sentence explains why his file was recoded. A broken instrument creates an engineering problem. A refused instrument creates a relationship, and relationships require 2 sides. Marr tried to leave the site on November 3, 1975. His truck was found 12 miles from the monitoring station, parked at the edge of the suppression radius marked in Vance's 1973 diagram. The driver door stood open. The keys remained in the ignition. Marr was found 70 yards away in a dry drainage channel, lying face up on compacted soil. The surviving notes recorded no water, no fire, and no struggle pattern. The medical anomaly was respiratory. His lungs contained insufficient residual air for the position of the body. The line did not cite smoke, fluid, dust, or obstruction. It described a body whose breathing volume had been removed without the usual event attached. Cause of death was entered as exposure. The administrative card closes with one sentence. Environmental explanation accepted. That sentence does the work of a grave. Then the file changes format. Vance does not receive an ordinary personnel card. He receives a status override, and the override appears on separate paper stock, as if someone wanted the classification to survive, even if the biography did not. Status code, Victor 00. Classification, biologically unavailable. Subject function, primary technical witness. Review outcome, internal audit, terminated. This is the center of the chapter. The previous records show how the matrix interacted with hearing, sight, mechanical contact, and respiration. Vance's file shows what happened when the observer remained close enough to connect the channels into a single model. By late 1975, his notes became repetitive. He copied one phrase across 3 separate pages. Human tissue may entrain to suppressed seismic interval. Entrainment is synchronization. A pendulum can entrain. A cardiac rhythm can entrain. A person should not entrain to geological silence unless the silence is no longer simply the absence of vibration. Vance wore a biometric badge during the final audit period, and although the device was crude by modern standards, it recorded enough to create a pattern. His resting tremor frequency drifted toward the same 32 to 40 Hz band logged by Marr. His sleep movement flattened during regional signal activity. His pulse variability decreased when core samples were unpacked. The medical review did not diagnose him. It classified him biologically unavailable for internal audit review. The phrase appears twice, once in his transfer order and once in a medical routing slip. Ordinary agencies possess ordinary categories such as sick leave, reassignment, retirement, suspension, and death. Biologically unavailable belongs to a different logic. It treats the body as evidence. It treats review as exposure. Vance was reassigned to a remote depot in New Mexico, after which the paper trail thins into fragments. No hearing transcript follows. No publication follows. No retirement notice appears. The appendix attaches no obituary. Only one delayed statement remains. It is dated 1988, unsigned, and filed behind his personnel transfer sheet. The language matches his margin notes. The statement says he was told to stop recording non-responsive ground behavior because the data suggested a formation capable of accepting energy, retaining pattern, and synchronizing biological motion. The final paragraph is handwritten. The issue is participation. We detonated inside a medium that answered by withholding return. Ah, wow. Below it, Vance added one instruction. Do not measure it during signal load. The page had been folded twice before being placed back into the file. Someone wanted it preserved. Someone else wanted it unreachable. Both decisions held for 50 years. Chapter 4. Administrative Isolation and 2026 Metrics. In 1976, Rio Blanco entered its most efficient phase. The engineering language ended, and the administrative language began. Physical sites are difficult to erase. Roads remain, fences remain. Contractors keep invoices, and local surveyors retain maps long after federal terminology changes. A facility can survive in the world even after it has been removed from the logic of responsibility. The solution was category removal. Access roads were renamed. Maintenance lines were reassigned. Insurance schedules were expunged. Environmental references narrowed around contamination, while geological references narrowed around failed gas stimulation. No single public document needed to carry the entire omission. Each only needed to remove the same shape. The Atomic Energy Commission and CEE, our John Nuclear Corporation, had both been tied to the original Rio Blanco operation, which made their later record behavior more than administrative tidying. They had names, budgets, technical authority, and a motive deeper than embarrassment. They had seen a failed energy problem become a possible infrastructure asset. That is the human hook the file tries to hide. A shapeless government cover-up is easy to ignore, but a named institutional decision carries weight because it introduces agency. Someone approved the language. Someone separated the tables. Someone decided Vance's data should be preserved only where ordinary readers would never connect it. Public story said the gas was unusable. The private record suggested the substrate was useful. By 1976, The graphite light conversion was no longer merely a hazard. In the wrong hands, it looked like a storage medium produced under nuclear pressure, capable of absorbing signal, retaining pattern, and responding selectively to load. That possibility changed the moral center of the file. The question was no longer what the shale had done. The question was, who decided to wait? By 1981, Vance's station codes had been removed from revised Western stability references. By 1986, the core custody chain was functionally broken. By 1994, several road names in secondary documents no longer matched earlier facility maps. That was isolation. The ground remained. The records lost the ability to point at it. Then the modern trigger arrived. The year 2026 mattered because the surface above Rio Blanco had become a measurement machine. By then, high-capacity fiber routes, regional edge compute nodes, microwave relay density, commercial Earth observation tasking, and next-generation synthetic aperture radar monitoring had converged over the same western corridor Vance warned should not be measured under signal load. The ground was no longer being crossed. It was being interrogated. The first hard anomaly did not appear in a government memoir or a speculative physics paper. It appeared inside a commercial geospatial processing queue, where a Capella Space synthetic aperture radar tasking record over western Colorado failed the normal coherence pipeline 3 times in one acquisition window. That gave the file a name. Not a satellite pass. A Capella Space radar pass. The failure was later cross-checked against optical base map products from Maxar Technologies and Planet Labs, where the surface showed no visible crater, plume, burn scar, excavation, landslide, or construction footprint large enough to explain the radar loss. The optical scene looked ordinary. The radar scene did not. That contradiction is the hook. The eye saw land. The instrument saw refusal. The coordinate center was 39.7833 degrees north and 107.8167 degrees west. The flagged radar product described a persistent processing void approximately 300 meters across, with a bounded loss perimeter, repeated phase instability, and amplitude behavior inconsistent with weather, vegetation, slope distortion, or ordinary terrain shadow. The report did not say hole. It said processing loss. That phrase matters because processing loss is how modern systems hide impossible objects from human attention. The machine does not announce an anomaly. It marks the region as unusable, stores the failure code, and lets the analyst move to cleaner data. Vance had already predicted the habit. Future instruments will believe this is an error. The radar system did exactly that. Its first response was rejection. A single failed acquisition can be dismissed. A second can be blamed on angle, atmospheric interference, or pre-processing alignment. A third failure, centered over the same coordinate set and repeating under different collection geometry, becomes a behavioral record. The void was not random. It had edges. It had timing. It had load dependence. The restricted engineering comment was brief enough to survive as a margin note. Loss boundary correlates with regional signal load. That line reopened Vance's final warning. Do not measure it during signal load. The 2026 data showed that the radar void sharpened during peak telecommunications traffic across the western grid. When regional data throughput increased, the loss boundary became cleaner. When load dropped, the boundary softened. During the highest load windows, the processing void expanded by measurable increments. Not miles, meters. That smaller number is more useful because functioning systems rarely perform theatrically. They adjust. They scale. They respond to load with disciplined increments, the way heat sinks. Routers, batteries, and processors respond when demand rises through a known threshold. The old shale matrix had accepted blast energy in 1973. It had suppressed microtremors. It had converted steel contact surfaces. It had organized carbon-rich crystalline tracks. It had altered human tremor frequencies. Decades later, the same coordinate region produced radar coherence loss synchronized with data traffic above it. The implication was no longer purely geological. It was infrastructural. That is where the human decision re-enters the file. The Atomic Energy Commission and CEER John Nuclear did not need to understand the matrix completely in 1976. They only needed to understand one category of value. A buried carbon-rich substrate had absorbed energy, retained pattern, and refused signal return under measurable conditions. To a safety officer, that is a hazard. To an infrastructure planner, it is an asset. That is the moral fracture. A failed nuclear gas experiment could be closed. A responsive carbon substrate could be quarantined, studied, and preserved until American signal infrastructure became dense enough to activate it without another detonation. The public received the failure story. The contractors retained the coordinates. The cruelty was not panic. The cruelty was patience. By removing Vance from the registry, separating the core custody chain, recoding personnel exposure, and narrowing public language around contaminated gas, the institutions did not erase Rio Blanco. They protected a future interface from premature scrutiny. The site was not abandoned. It was left unclaimed. That distinction is the center of the case. Abandoned sites decay in the record. Unclaimed sites wait inside mismatched categories until a later system discovers them again. In 2026, the later system was not a drilling crew. It was commercial remote sensing, high-throughput telecommunications, and automated geospatial analytics built to notice everything, except the one thing their own error codes were trained to discard. The Capella Space radar pass did not discover the anomaly. It rediscovered Vance's instrument problem. The instrument asked the ground for a return. The ground withheld it. The optical cross-checks from Maxar Technologies and Planet Labs made the case worse, because they removed the easy visible explanation. No surface scar explained the loss. No construction footprint explained the timing. No terrain feature explained the correlation with regional signal load. The surface was innocent. The subsurface was not. This does not require the word consciousness. That word gives the viewer a face, and the file does not provide one. The better term is active substrate, a buried matrix capable of accepting, routing, storing, and withholding energy according to conditions outside public infrastructure models. If that term sounds too clean, replace it with Vance's language. Participation. He found ground that did not merely receive force. He found ground that selected response. He found carbon residue arranging itself into repeated tracks. He found living tissue drifting toward the frequency of seismic absence. Then he watched the file system close around the evidence. That is why the ending cannot be about a list of towers and cables. The viewer already understands the infrastructure. Repeating the inventory wastes the final minute. The final minute must show the conversion of human ambition into a feeding mechanism. The West did not build over the matrix. It trained it. Every upgrade increased signal density. Every satellite pass improved the questioning. Every fiber expansion raised the background load. Every automated processing system learned to classify the missing return as error, removing the anomaly from the human screen while preserving the conditions that made it sharper. That is not concealment by darkness. That is concealment by software. The final page of Vance's appendix contains no conclusion. It contains a table with 6 typed columns: device interval, pressure behavior, thermal behavior, acoustic behavior, material behavior, and biological behavior. A 7th column was added by hand. Signal behavior. Every cell in that column is blank. At the bottom of the page, Vance wrote one sentence: "Future instruments will believe this is an error." That sentence is no longer a warning. It is a description of the system now operating above him. The radar processor believed it was an error. The optical base map saw nothing. The commercial archive stored the failed tile as unusable. The infrastructure continued routing traffic across the same ground, increasing the one input Vance specifically warned against. Different decade. Same drawer. The files do not show a monster under Colorado. They show a decision chain. Atomic Energy Commission containment language. CEA. Joan nuclear custody gaps. Personnel recoding. Removed seismology. Broken core inventory. Capella Space radar lost. Maxar Technologies and Planet Labs optical contradiction. Signal load correlation. The anomaly is not that the ground learned. The anomaly is that people noticed early enough to profit from waiting. The roads are still there. The coordinates are still there. The official story is still there. The missing return is still there. The files remain incomplete. Select the next log on your screen to continue the audit. Subscribe to preserve the legend.